High up on the hill, at the furthest point from the sea, an ancient wall marked the boundary of the city. Looking down from this height, the landmarks of religion dominated. Dozens of minarets rose into the air like needles in a pincushion. Red-tiled domes of churches and dozens of pale synagogues dotted the cityscape in its great sweep down towards the Gulf.
The city had improved in the past few decades with the laying down of some broad boulevards, which contrasted with the ancient pattern of winding lanes that snaked like the serpents of the Medusa's hair up the steep gradient towards the upper town. As well as the hundreds of traditional cafeneans, there were European-style cafes serving Viennese beer and clubs where people discussed literature and philosophy.
In the center was a flower market where the fragrance of bloom still hung in the air for many hours after the stallholders had packed up and gone home. And in the long streets, orange streets in blossom provided not only shade, but the most intoxicating aroma of all. There were many houses where jasmine rampaged around the doors, its aromatic white petals carpeting the road like snow. At all times of day, the smell of cooking suffused the atmosphere, along with wafts of roasted coffee made on small stoves and carried through the streets. In the markets, colorful savory spices, such as turmeric, paprika, and cinnamon, were shaped by the seller into small mountain peaks, and plumes of aromatic smoke curled up from nargilés smoked outside the cafes.
Once the feverish temperatures of August came, the citizens of Thessaloniki looked back with wistfulness to the warmth of May. It was now 40 degrees in the shade, and people closed their windows and shutters to keep the fearsome heat outside. There was a breeze of sorts, but even this provided no relief. The westerly Vardaris blew its hot breath over the city, bringing layers of fine, dark dust into people's homes. Streets were deserted in the hottest hours of the day, and a traveler might mistakenly have imagined that these houses had been abandoned. Inside, it was equally silent as people lay in the darkness, their breathing shallow and inaudible as they tried not to take in the fetid air. Air and sea alike were thick and still. When children dived into the sea, the ripples spread 100 meters across the bay. As they pulled themselves out of the water, they dried in an instant, leaving a stinging residue of salt. There was little variation at night, and the air remained as motionless as the reading on the barometer.
On the same sweltering Saturday afternoon, perhaps even at the very moment when little Dimitri Komnenos emerged into the world, a woman began to cook her family's meager dinner. She lived in a very different kind of house from the Komnenos mansion. Like hundreds of others, her home was in a densely populated quarter just within the old city walls in the northwest of the city. It was where the poorest people of Thessaloniki lived. Christians, Muslims, Jews, and refugees crowded on top of each other in streets where there was little money but plenty of life.
It was into this dark and fetid space that a small spark from the fire found its way that afternoon. 1,000 times before, an ember such as these had been sped out by the crackling wood and then floated slowly down to the floor, where it glowed for a moment and then died. This one, however, flew with the accuracy of a well-aimed arrow through the narrow space between the floorboards, and in its trajectory seemed to pick up heat from its own gathering speed. It dropped onto the mule's rump, where it was instantly flicked off by its tail.
It was a matter of seconds before the flames curled around the wooden beams and came along the ceiling. Soon the whole ground floor room was alight, and walls and ceiling became sheets of flame as the fire progressed with speed and efficiency upwards to the next floor, and then outwards to adjacent homes.
Within an hour of ignition, dozens of these homes were gone. The largely wooden construction and the summer drought had turned the city into a tinderbox. There had been no rain since June, and there was nothing to stand in the way of the fire spread. The city had a few fire engines, but they were old and inefficient, and in any case, much of the local water supply had been diverted to the vast encampments of Allied troops outside Thessaloniki.
Suddenly, the ground beneath them rocked and the tailor's shop was taken to its foundations. A moment ago, it had seemed a safe haven, but now everyone, the tailor, his family, the communist brothers, and Tassos, rushed back out into the street. There had been an explosion somewhere in the city, and amidst mountaining house and fear, there was another and then a third. People hastening away from the fires seemed to quicken their pace. It's foreign soldiers, one man told them as he passed. They had started blowing up buildings. It was not an act of insanity, but the only possibility of halting the fire. With a dire shortage of water in the city, the creation of a fire break was the only solution anyone could think of, and Allied soldiers had come into the city to help.
A pungent odor hung in the atmosphere, but now that the sun had set, the sootings of the air blended in with the night sky. Incongruously, a hotel was still serving dinner to its guests, and cafe tables were still occupied by people sipping their drinks. Thessaloniki seemed to have divided itself into two unrelated worlds. Those south of Agnatia Street knew of the fire, but were certain of their own safety. There was nothing they could do to help, and it was their duty to be kind.
The whole of the seafront was now ablaze, and falling buildings presented new danger as iron balustrades began to melt, and walls collapsed thunderously into the street. That day, many were convinced that a miracle took place. The fire had cared little for any religion. There were a few minarets still standing, like tree trunks in a burned-out wood, but almost every synagogue had been razed. Dozens of churches had been lost as well, but when the fire reached the ancient basilica of Hagia Sophia, it mysteriously stopped. Some saw it as an answer to their prayers.
Eventually, they saw a sight that would have saddened the hardest of hearts: the burned-out church of Agios Dimitri, the city's patron saint. The flames had consumed it. Both the brothers had memories of their parents' funeral services being held there, and it is where Konstantinos and Olga had been married. Now it was just an open space, a courtyard, its floor paled high with bricks, its painted apse exposed to light and air for the first time in its hundreds of years of history. It was naked, undignified. The hotel Splendid, where people had dined on the night of the 18th of August, totally confident that the flames would never reach them, was gutted. Leonida's favorite haunt, a seafront cafe on the edge of Eleftheria Square, had met the same fate. The square, which had been the heart of the city's social life, was now silent. Meanwhile, a local French-language newspaper was preparing its first edition following the fire. Its stark headline said it all: La mort d'une ville, death of a city.
Olga had heard stories of the refugee centers that had been set up on the outside of the city for the tens of thousands left homeless by the fire. Though many of them were well ordered and run by kindly foreigners, everything was rationed, and come the winter, life would be harsh there. The only other option for the 70,000 homeless, if their relatives could not accommodate them, was to take one of the free trains to Larissa or a boat to Volos, where new housing was being built. The majority of those who had been left destitute were Jews, and thousands of them had no choice but to leave.